The clock struck midnight on March 28, 2025, and for the fourth time in 7 years, the United States federal government began shutting down. But this time felt different. This wasn't just another political standoff in Washington. This was the moment when nearly 2 million federal workers received furlough notices, when essential services ground to a halt, and when ordinary Americans finally said enough is enough. What happened next would shake the foundations of American democracy and remind those in power of a fundamental truth that dates back to the nation's founding. In America, there are no kings. Welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most turbulent periods in modern American history, examining how a government shutdown transformed into mass layoffs, which then ignited a nationwide movement that historians are already calling the No Kings Uprising. This isn't just another political story. This is about real people, real consequences, and a reminder that power in a democracy ultimately belongs to the people. If you care about the future of America, if you've ever felt powerless watching political games play out in Washington, or if you're just trying to understand what's really happening in our country right now, you need to hear this story. So hit that subscribe button, because we're about to break down the events that brought us to this unprecedented moment in American political history. Let me take you back to the beginning of 2025. The new congressional session had just begun, and the usual budget negotiations were underway. But this time, the stakes were impossibly high. Deep partisan divisions over spending priorities, particularly around border security, climate initiatives, and defense budgets, created a deadlock that neither side seemed willing to break. Democrats controlled the Senate by the slimmest of margins, while Republicans held the House with a fragile majority constantly threatened by internal divisions. The Freedom Caucus on the right and the Progressive Caucus on the left both refused to budge, and moderates in both parties found themselves without enough leverage to forge a compromise. As the deadline approached, Americans watched with a mixture of frustration and resignation. We'd seen this movie before. Surely, at the last minute, cooler heads would prevail. Some backroom deal would emerge. Someone would blink. But this time, nobody blinked. When the clock ran out, the government shut down, and what followed was unlike anything we'd experienced in previous shutdowns. The first week was relatively quiet. National parks closed. Passport offices shut their doors. Museums went dark. Federal websites displayed maintenance messages. It seemed manageable, even if inconvenient. But by the second week, the cracks began to show. TSA agents at airports worked without pay, and security lines stretched for hours. Food safety inspectors stayed home, raising concerns about the safety of America's food supply. Small businesses that relied on federal loans or contracts found themselves in limbo. Federal courts began limiting operations. Then came the third week, and everything changed. With no resolution in sight and mounting pressure from hardline factions demanding spending cuts, the administration made a decision that would prove catastrophic. They announced that if the shutdown extended beyond 30 days, they would begin implementing what they called efficiency measures. Federal agencies would need to operate with skeleton crews indefinitely. This wasn't just a temporary furlough anymore. This was the beginning of what would become the largest reduction in the federal workforce in modern history. The announcement sent shockwaves through communities across America. See, most people don't realize how deeply woven federal employment is into the fabric of American life. We're not just talking about politicians in Washington. We're talking about forest rangers in Montana, agricultural inspectors in Iowa, air traffic controllers in Texas, researchers at the CDC in Georgia, and Veterans Affairs counselors in every state. We're talking about people who process Social Security claims, who maintain our national defense systems, who ensure our food and drugs are safe, who protect our national parks, who help small businesses get loans. When the mass layoffs began, the impact was immediate and devastating. In some communities, particularly around Washington, D.C., federal employees made up a significant portion of the local economy. Restaurants that catered to lunch crowds from government offices suddenly saw business drop by half. Child care centers that served federal workers faced closure. Local shops and services that depended on steady federal paychecks watched their revenue evaporate overnight. But the economic impact was only part of the story. What really ignited the fire was the sense of betrayal. These weren't political appointees or highly paid executives. These were career civil servants who had dedicated their lives to public service. Many were veterans. Many came from working-class backgrounds and had spent decades building expertise in their fields. They'd served through multiple administrations, both Republican and Democrat, doing their jobs regardless of who sat in the Oval Office. And now they were being treated as expendable pawns in a political game. The spark that lit the fuse came from an unexpected place. In early April, a leaked memo from a congressional leadership meeting went viral on social media. In it, a senior congressman referred to federal workers as, quote, bloated bureaucratic deadweight, and suggested that the layoffs were an opportunity to, quote, drain the swamp once and for all. The memo was callous, dismissive, and revealed a profound contempt for the very people who made government function. Within hours, the hashtag No Kings Uprising began trending. It started with a tweet from a furloughed park ranger who wrote, "Our founders fought a revolution because they refused to bow to a king. We refuse to bow to politicians who treat us like subjects instead of citizens. No kings in America. Not then. Not now. Not ever." The message resonated because it tapped into something fundamental in the American psyche. The whole point of the American experiment was to reject the idea that some people are inherently superior to others, that some class of elites has the right to rule over everyone else. What happened next was extraordinary. Peaceful protests erupted in cities across the nation. Federal workers, joined by private sector employees, students, retirees, and citizens from all walks of life, took to the streets. These weren't organized by any political party or special interest group. They were organic, grassroots movements that sprang up simultaneously in hundreds of communities. In Washington, D.C., tens of thousands gathered on the National Mall. In San Francisco, protesters shut down Market Street. In Dallas, demonstrators filled Dealey Plaza. In Atlanta, crowds marched through downtown chanting, "We the people, not we the subjects." The movement deliberately avoided partisan political symbols. No red hats, no blue waves. Instead, protesters carried American flags and signs with quotes from the Founding Fathers. They invoked the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the fundamental principles that supposedly defined American democracy. They weren't protesting as liberals or conservatives. They were protesting as Americans who felt their government had forgotten who it served. The demands were clear and resonated across traditional political divides. First, end the shutdown immediately and restore funding for essential government operations. Second, reinstate all furloughed workers with back pay. Third, implement reforms to prevent future shutdowns from being used as political weapons. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, create mechanisms for greater accountability of elected officials to the people they serve. What made the No Kings Uprising particularly powerful was its coalition. You had conservative veterans standing shoulder to shoulder with progressive students. You had rural farmers marching alongside urban professionals. You had people who disagreed on almost every policy issue, finding common ground in the belief that government should serve the people, not play games with their livelihoods and their country's stability. The protests remained overwhelmingly peaceful, which only amplified their moral authority. When a few incidents of violence occurred, protesters themselves intervened to stop them and turned agitators over to police. They understood that violence would undermine their message and give opponents an excuse to dismiss their concerns. This was about principle, not chaos. As the protests grew, pressure mounted on political leaders from all sides. Business leaders began speaking out about the economic damage. Military leaders expressed concern about national security implications. Governors from both parties called for federal action. International allies questioned America's stability. The longer the standoff continued, the clearer it became that this was doing serious damage to America's global standing and domestic cohesion. Behind closed doors, the political calculus began to shift. Polling showed overwhelming public support for ending the shutdown and restoring federal workers. Even among voters who generally favored smaller government, the way the situation had been handled was deeply unpopular. Politicians who had been holding firm on their positions began to recognize that they were on the wrong side of public opinion. The breakthrough came when a bipartisan group of senators and representatives, calling themselves the Common Sense Caucus, announced they would not support any legislation until the shutdown ended and federal workers were restored. This wasn't about policy anymore. This was about basic governance and respect for public servants. Their defection gave moderates in both parties the cover they needed to break with hardliners. After 47 days, the longest government shutdown in American history finally ended. A temporary budget resolution passed with bipartisan support, funding the government for 6 months, while a special commission worked on longer-term budget reforms. All furloughed workers were reinstated with back pay and an official apology from congressional leadership. More significantly, Congress passed the Government Stability Act, which created new mechanisms to prevent future shutdowns and establish stronger protections for federal employees against politically motivated layoffs. But perhaps the most important legacy of the No Kings Uprising wasn't any specific policy change. It was the reminder that in a democracy, power ultimately flows from the consent of the governed. When enough people stand up and demand accountability, even the most entrenched political interests have to listen. The Founding Fathers designed American democracy with checks and balances precisely because they understood the danger of concentrated power. They'd lived under a king and fought a revolution to establish the principle that government derives its authority from the people, not the other way around. The events of 2025 exposed deep structural problems in American governance. The fact that a government shutdown could happen at all, let alone extend for nearly 7 weeks and threaten millions of jobs, revealed how broken the budget process had become. The willingness of political leaders to use essential government functions as bargaining chips showed how far removed they'd become from the real-world consequences of their decisions. And the contempt displayed toward public servants reflected a broader disconnect between those in power and those they serve. But the uprising also revealed something hopeful about America. When pushed to the brink, Americans across the political spectrum could still find common ground in defending fundamental democratic principles. They could still organize peacefully and effectively. They could still hold their leaders accountable. The system was strained, perhaps nearly broken, but not beyond repair. The aftermath of the No Kings Uprising continues to reshape American politics. Several long-serving members of Congress chose not to seek re-election, recognizing that voters had lost faith in their leadership. New candidates emerged, promising to prioritize governance over partisan warfare. Civic engagement surged as Americans who'd felt powerless realized they could make a difference. Organizations dedicated to government reform and accountability saw their membership explode. Of course, deep divisions remain. The policy disagreements that triggered the original shutdown haven't disappeared. Americans still disagree profoundly about the size and role of government, about spending priorities, about the direction of the country. But there's a growing recognition that certain principles must transcend partisan politics. Government should function. Public servants deserve respect. Political games shouldn't jeopardize national stability or individual livelihoods. And ultimately, elected officials are servants of the people, not rulers over them. So here we are, months after the crisis ended, still processing what it means for America's future. The No Kings Uprising won't solve all of our political problems. It won't bridge every divide or answer every difficult policy question. But it served as a crucial reminder of who holds the real power in a democracy. Not the politicians in Washington, not the wealthy donors or special interests. The people. The ordinary citizens who make this country work every single day. That's the story of the 2025 government shutdown, the mass layoffs, and America's No Kings Uprising. It's a story about failure and resilience, about broken systems and people determined to fix them, about the enduring power of democratic principles even in polarized times. Thanks so much for watching today's video. This is exactly the kind of in-depth political analysis and storytelling we do here on this channel. If you found this valuable, smash that like button and subscribe so you never miss our coverage of the events shaping America's future. Drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts on what happened in 2025 and what lessons we should take from it. Do you think the reforms that came out of the uprising will last, or will we slide back into the same dysfunctional patterns? I read every comment, and I'm genuinely curious about your perspective. Share this video with anyone who cares about American democracy, because this is a story that every citizen needs to understand. Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and remember, in America, there are no kings. The power belongs to we, the people.